All right, let's get to our panel. Joining us here in the studio is Rasha Ilaz. She's a journalist and senior fellow with PS21. That's the Project for the Study of the 21st Century. From London, we're joined by Alexander Nekrasov. He's a former advisor to the Kremlin and a Russian analyst. And Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Rasha, let me start here in the studio with you. We look at the war in Syria. It's now entering its 8th year. We've seen 7 years of absolute carnage, 500,000 people killed by one estimate, many more injured. Half the population of Syria has been displaced. What is the assessment of the war right now? You know, we heard our reporters say that it would be wishful thinking to think that this is coming to an end.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say the biggest irony is that we're here yet again talking about this, 8 years or 7 years. And it just seems to be the same story over and over again, except every time it's slightly more escalated. I think it's clear that the Assad regime, along with Russia and Iran, are not going to budge. And there's no one in power who's willing to step up to the plate and really push that push it toward any sort of solution. And at the end of the day, you ask people in Syria, where do you think this is headed? And I think everyone will agree, regardless of their political inclination, that this has turned into a war of attrition. And I think that's what we're looking at now.
Has Bashar al-Assad prevailed in this war, if we look at the situation on the battlefield right now?
He may not have prevailed, but certainly he has because of his strong allies. Who's going to go up against Russia and Iran at the same time?
All right, let's go to London and to Alexander Nekrasov. Alexander, as we just heard, Russia has played no small role in supporting Bashar al-Assad. It has troops in Syria. It's been using its air force in Syria as well. What's in it for Russia? What's Moscow's ultimate goal here?
Well, I think Russia interfered into this conflict when it was getting out of control. We have seen what happened in Iraq, we have seen what happened in Libya, and this situation in Syria was threatening to basically spread across the whole region. But I think we gathered together today not to discuss what happened in the past. Let's talk about the future. Let's say what conclusions have been drawn that could help us deal with this conflict in the future. And the first point I would like to make is that the international security structure has failed completely, including the United Nations. They have not managed not just to help stop this conflict or even de-escalate the conflict. They've done absolutely nothing to help in its resolution. So different countries, America, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and so on, they took it on themselves to try to resolve it. This doesn't work. This will never work. There has to be a new system of international security. So that's one lesson that should be learned for the future. Secondly, there is absolutely no point in having a multinational-sided conflict and then try to see who is the guilty party. It's impossible. You can't calculate who is the guilty party. So the problem is here that how do you sort of basically make this conflict at least calculable, at least that you allow people to see where are the main players here and then address it in a sense talk with the main players. Now also a third point, very important as regards America and the West. We have seen total chaos under Obama and then under Trump, where the CIA had one agenda, the Pentagon had another agenda, the MI6 had another agenda, and so on, and so on, and so on. When you have this disunity among the armed forces of the countries which are involved there, and don't forget Saudi Arabia and Turkey, of course, when you have no united front by NATO countries, when you have these sort of, silly games played by intelligence services and military intelligence, nothing will come out of it. They have to have discipline, in America especially, because it's the key player in the whole region.
All right, let me get Michael O'Hanlon's view on that. Michael, we've heard a whole load of criticisms there of the United States, of the international security order having failed in this instance in Syria, the fact that the United States does not have a coordinated strategy to deal with this crisis. What's your response?
I actually agree with most of what Alexander just said, but I would pick up where he stopped and talk about Russia's role as also not very constructive. Yes, it's been coordinated, but it's been coordinated in a very brutal way, in cahoots with Bashar al-Assad, with brutal attacks on civilian populations that were seen as somehow harboring insurgents, but much of the actual effect has been to kill more people. Now, in defense of Russia, I would agree with Alexander that it only entered the war 4 years in after the Western world had stumbled about with no cohesive strategy and no appreciable positive impact on the war either. So I'm not trying to blame Russia more than the United States. But I think in the same spirit that he mentioned, we have to start looking ahead to constructive solutions. We have to figure out how to arrest this conflict as soon as possible. Earlier, your other guest, Russia, talked about how things just keep getting worse. That's true, although they also keep getting different. We've got new challenges now. ISIS is weakened, but unfortunately the al-Qaeda former affiliate in Syria is still going strong up in the northwest. We've got Turkey playing a role up there. We've got Assad attacking East Ghouta. We've got some ceasefire zones in the south of the country that are showing some promise, some stability in the Kurdish north that's showing some promise. So we have some pieces to work with. And now the question is, how can we create some kind of a situation in which Assad is temporarily still in power, because that's the reality of it, but there can be some autonomy and some recovery in a few of these other zones. That, I think, is the most realistic path forward, and I think we have to all work together on that.
Okay, let's get the view from Damascus right now. We're joined by Bassam Abu Abdullah. He's the political analyst and professor of international relations. Thanks for joining us. Bassam, what is your assessment of the status of the war right now? We see still battles continuing in eastern Ghouta, the Turks surrounding the area around Afrin. What is your assessment?
Thank you very much for having me. I have heard my colleagues from Russia and from the United States. First of all, we should now, after 7 years, I think a lot of evidence is more clearly for everyone in the world. The question is here not a question of dictatorship and democracy and freedom. Either we can recognize that we need, like any other state or any other people, we have the right to have reforms. But we know that the models which we could see in Syria of opposition, example, eastern part of Ghouta or the north of Syria, they are fundamentalist religious groups, terrorist groups. They are not ready to accept any other opinion. This is first. Secondly, that the question in Syria is a question of geopolitical big game. This is not a question of democracy. Either United States cannot here give us a lecture about the model of democracy, because we could see experiences of US in Libya or the West generally in Libya. We could see in Yemen now with the model, or we could see in Iraq what is the model in these states. In Afghanistan, after 16 years of NATO presence, nothing happened for the future of these people. So we are in front of a geopolitical struggle between uprising states, Russia, China, and others, and the United States and some Western countries who don't want to accept these new players on the international arena.
Great. Russia, let me get your response to what you've just heard.
You know, there's one unfortunate point here. It seems that everybody's narrative and point of view evolves except that of Assad. You know, it's still the same sort of repeated broken record that basically what Mr. Bassam is saying, if it's not Assad, it's the terrorists. If it's not us, then it's the fundamentalist, Islamist terrorists. That's not necessarily the case. People of Ghouta, I've been to Ghouta. Many of us have been to Ghouta. Maybe Mr. Bassam has been there. There are a lot of civilians, just ordinary Syrians who live there, women, children, men, even men who took up arms, and even men who joined al-Qaeda. They can be turned back. They can return to what the regime itself calls the fold of the homeland, the embrace of the homeland. And it has been done in previous, previous brokered ceasefires. But I think this sort of stubbornness of sticking to, well, it's either me or them, the evil devils, it just doesn't go anywhere, and it really needs to evolve to move the narrative forward.
Okay, let me get Michael O'Hanlon's view on this. Michael, do you see any common ground? I mean, we've heard the view there from Damascus, from the Syrian side. What is the common ground that could bring these two sides together, if at all?
Common ground is hard to establish, although Russia is certainly right that some people can be brought back to a common ground. But there's been so much killing. I think Assad has lost his legitimacy as a leader over parts of Syria where there are primarily Sunni Arab and Kurdish populations. I don't see that being recovered or restored. By the same token, however, he is in power, and he's come closer to winning this war than losing it. So realistically, we need a strategy that helps some of the areas of the country in the northeast and south govern autonomously, at least temporarily, get some recovery assistance from the international community, at least temporarily, in their own regions. Meanwhile, Assad is going to have to face the prospect that if he wants to see the central population belt get recovery assistance and reconstruction assistance, he's got to figure out a strategy to ease himself out of power. I think the Geneva process is dead. It's not going to create a new coalition government of national unity, because for Assad that means defeat. He is not going to go along with that. But he does have to, I think, find some way to broaden the government's representation and ultimately find a way for himself to step down. Otherwise, the international community is not going to provide the kind of help that Damascus and other major cities need to get back on their feet. I think that's got to be some essence, some element of the overall strategy going forward. We're not going to get a clean change in rule, and we're not going to get a clean win for Assad, and we're certainly not going to get everyone deciding to reconcile altogether.
Michael, I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes, so I have one final question to put to you, and that is something that's come out of the UN, coming from the UN ambassador, the US UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, who has warned that if the UN fails to take steps to end this carnage, then Washington will act. Let's listen to what she had to say.
The ceasefire has failed. The situation of the civilians in eastern Ghouta is dire, and the United States is acting. We have drafted a new ceasefire resolution that provides no room for evasion. It is simple, straightforward, and binding. It will take effect immediately upon adoption by this Council. It contains no counterterrorism loopholes for Assad, Iran, and the Russians to hide behind.
So, Michael, tough words there from Nikki Haley, but at this stage, realistically, what can the US do?
It's an excellent question. I've been pondering what she has in mind. I think one thing one could imagine is the same kind of strike that the Trump administration carried out last year after the chemical weapons attack, eliminating some fraction of Assad's air force. That probably does not prevent him from being able to attack eastern Ghouta in other ways. But perhaps we feel like the punishment and depriving him of that military power would be a prospect that he doesn't want to face, because it would lessen his ability to consolidate control going forward. Beyond that kind of attack, and maybe against some large artillery, I don't really know what the United States could realistically do that would contain the risks and limit the American exposure, because the Trump administration clearly has no interest in entering into this war on a large scale. So I think the most likely prospect would be some limited attacks on Assad's air force and maybe some of his large caliber artillery.
Thanks, Michael. That's where we say goodbye to you, Michael O'Hanlon. Thanks for being with us. The rest of our panelists will stay with us, but first we're going to be taking a break. More of our conversation about the Syrian civil war and international efforts to end the violence right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.